Hi, I'm Colette Massengale.
And I'm Kathleen D'Artez.
We're here today to discuss new Maryland Realtor forms. Thanks for joining us.
Colette, please tell us about the new forms that we are introducing for 2018-2019.
There are 3 new forms. I'll start with the escrow agreement between buyer, seller, and escrow agent.
What was the rationale for preparing this form?
The form is intended to be used in situations where the buyer and the seller agree that a third party other than the real estate broker will hold the deposit.
Is the escrow agreement part of the contract of sale?
No, the escrow agreement is not part of the contract of sale.
Okay, can you explain to us when would the buyer, seller, and escrow agent sign the escrow agreement?
That's a good question. Buyer and seller and escrow agent would sign the escrow agreement after the contract is formed. I would say as soon as possible or immediately following contract formation.
Should the agents involved in the transaction confirm with the escrow agent that the earnest money deposit has been received?
Yes. The agents involved in the transaction should confirm with the escrow agent that the earnest money deposit has been received. I would also recommend that they make a written note to the file that they made the inquiry. Additionally, the agent should get written confirmation that the escrow monies have been deposited into the escrow account.
What if there's an additional deposit? How is that handled?
The agreement allows for the parties to include an original deposit and an additional deposit. In paragraph 3, they would insert the amount of the original and additional deposit, if any. On page 2, the escrow agent would insert the date that they received the original and additional deposit, if any.
What if the wire is dishonored or the check is returned?
The escrow agent is actually obligated via the agreement to notify both buyer and seller and the agents involved in the transaction that there's been an issue with the deposit.
When does the escrow agent turn over the earnest money deposit to whoever's conducting the settlement?
The escrow agreement actually obligates the escrow agent to maintain the money in the escrow account until settlement. If the escrow agent is not conducting the settlement, then the escrow agent is obligated under the agreement to deliver the deposit to the settlement agent as soon as possible.
What happens if the transaction doesn't settle?
The escrow agreement specifies that the escrow agent can't release the deposit unless the escrow agent receives written instructions from the buyer and seller. So essentially, the buyer and seller would sign a release of deposit agreement. Once that occurs, the escrow agent would be able to disperse the deposit.
What if there's a dispute?
If there is a dispute, depending on what the contract says, the parties may have to submit the dispute to mediation. If buyer and seller arrive at an agreement during mediation, then the escrow agreement specifies that the escrow agent would disperse the escrow monies in accordance with the terms of whatever agreement buyer and seller reach at mediation. It would be a written agreement, of course.
What if mediation is unsuccessful and the parties don't reach an agreement regarding how the money should be dispersed?
Paragraph 7C in the agreement authorizes the escrow agent to file an action for interpleader.
I think that covers the escrow agreement. Can you tell us about the other 2 new forms?
Yes, let's talk about the buyer hold harmless agreement next.
When would this form be used?
This form was created to be used in situations where the buyer is submitting an offer on a property sight unseen. The intent is to alert the buyer in writing that they really should do their own due diligence. The agreement lets the buyer know that the agent is not an inspector, contractor, surveyor, and so on. Essentially, buyers being put on notice that it's in their best interest to actually see the property to ensure that it suits their needs. The buyer is acknowledging that they've been made aware that they have the opportunity and the right to do their own due diligence and that they will not hold the buyer agent or broker responsible if it turns out that the property doesn't meet their needs after the fact.
That's a good way to alert buyers that, if possible, they really should see the property in person, but they may choose not to. If it's not feasible, or for whatever reason they choose not to, they will assume the risk and won't hold the agent or broker involved in the transaction liable. And what about the last new form?
So the last new form is the tenant-occupied addendum.
Why would a buyer or seller need this form?
This form was created to be used in situations where a buyer is going to be purchasing the property with a tenant in possession. In these situations, the buyer needs to be aware of certain things. For example, buyer needs to know that the security deposits must be transferred. This form facilitates that. Additionally, there may be a local requirement that property owners have a rental license. This form alerts the buyer that they may need to go out and get a rental license. If the property is constructed prior to 1978, then the lead registration needs to be done, and this form actually alerts the buyer to that requirement. The lead registration is not transferable.
Is there anything else we need to discuss regarding these 3 new forms?
I think we've covered everything. We want to thank you all for joining us to learn about the new forms and some best practices. If you have further questions, don't hesitate to call the legal hotline.
Okay, so that wraps up our discussion of the 3 new forms. Be sure to watch the 2 other short videos in the 2018-2019 Forms series. One explains the changes to the contract of sale and addenda, and the other explains the revisions made to the brokerage forms. Watch those videos to learn about those changes. Thanks again for watching.